fantastic to be here. I'm very happy for many reasons. One of the most important is to see all you young people being around. Of course, it's wonderful to see my old friends from who started this together with me in 2003, but it's even better to see all the young new people coming into this area. And there's something you do not really know, I have to tell you. And you are all the grandchildren of Christopher Freeman. Because the kind of generation who has brought this initiative Globelics into the world, we are the intellectual children of Chris Freeman. May I ask, just for fun, how many of you have been at Sprue or met Chris and got a big impression by that, etc.? How many of you you can say that? So the Sussex was a kind of special place. Huh? And Chris Freeman was a very special person. And this is why we decided to 2011 to install, Chris left us 2010. And 2011, after an initiative by Mamumuchi, we decided to introduce the Freeman Lecture. And we did so, number one, because he was the founding father of innovation studies, definitely in Europe. And also because he was such a great personality. I mean, he was so generous, very strict in academic terms. He wanted people to be serious, but he was extremely generous, especially with young people. So when Chris, I think it was his 70th year's birthday, what year was that?
91.
Huh?
It's 2001.
2001. Yeah, I gave Chris as a gift a small envelope. And in this envelope were only 2 handwritten lines, and I wrote, "Dear Chris, I give you as gift at your birthday to become member of the scientific board of an organization that doesn't exist yet." And as you could hear from José's presentation, he sent us the greeting to the first conference, and I think in a sense his spirit is very much among us. And now, we are so lucky to have Soete to give the Freeman Lecture. And Luc has become a very important person. He's now what you call Rector Magnificus for a very, very big university. And he's going to change the world through that mechanism and through his very important work in different European working groups and experts and so like that. But for me, Luc has always been a very important person. When we started this endeavor, he was like my twin brother. Or for people who know the comic stripes of Asterix and Obelix. You know that? I was Obelix, you know, the big clumsy guy, and Luc was Asterix, the small, smart guy. So this combination was very, very strong, and without his wisdom, normally we disagree, by the way, I should tell you that. Normally we disagree, but it's always a very productive disagreement. So, and the second one, so he's very important. It's always important to have important keynote speakers. So he's important both in the big scale, but also at the personal scale. But he also have the very special situation that he worked with Chris continuously for many years, and he was the one who followed him all the way. Luc organized with some colleagues his birthday every year, and he went there every year, and he was, so there is nobody as competent and as perfect for giving the Freeman lecture as Luc Soete. So let's give him a really big applause, okay?
Well, it's very difficult to say anything after being introduced in this way. Let me just say that I'm delighted to be here at Globelics 2013, the 11th time. I haven't been there all the time. Many of you, I think there was even a prize for the person who has been at all Globelics. I missed a couple. I missed Malaysia, I missed last year in China, I missed South Africa, that's about 3, I missed all those. But I think after hearing this morning also the president of Tubitak, it might be interesting to see the impact of Globelics on the performance of the countries where we've been. We might then typically be confronted with the endogenous nature of Globelics. Is Globelics going to countries which have high growth, like in this case in Turkey, or was Globelics at the start of a high growth pattern, as maybe in Brazil in 2003? I think it would be an interesting research topic for some of our young colleagues. But I'm delighted also, of course, to be able to give here the Freeman lecture, and particularly because, I mean, Bengt-Åke referred to it already, but I've been actually blessed in my academic life, also in my personal life, with lucky events. And one of these lucky events has been to meet Chris Freeman early in my life when I was a young PhD student. And I moved to Stroop, Sussex in September '75. And I got to know Chris, and I quickly started to write, to discuss, to debate, and collaborate with Chris Freeman. And so together we wrote over these long periods on lots of books, always fighting about who would be the second author. And Chris, for those of you who know him, was typically the person who was always pushing you to be the first author, and I was always pushing for being the second author. So we had an interesting fight over all these years. And if I look at it, the first one we published was in '78, the last one actually was in 2009. And afterwards, in the Journal of Maastricht, we published something after he passed away. The second lucky event, Bengt-Åke, was of course meeting Bengt-Åke. And again, that was at school in Sussex, and it was also a couple of years later, in the late 70s, when Bengt-Åke came with his Druid gang from this little village, Aalborg. And I sort of followed Bengt-Åke over all these years, and similarly met him in all sorts of places, at the OECD also. This was an interesting exchange we had there for some time. And then, of course, in his Druid village, Aalborg, where the idea with many of you here present of Globelics was born. And so in the initial years, what happened was that Bengt-Åke would welcome all of you, and I would kick you out at the end. Summarizing, which had the big advantage that nobody could put questions to me at the end, as this was the final commitment. It made me reflect also on this Ankara conference, that maybe this was the reason why we pushed always to have these conferences in the South. Because we wouldn't be bothered with the whole organization hassle, etc. And I still admire all the people who take this on board to organize a conference of this size, of this sort, within a framework of the South. And maybe we just have been extremely clever, Bengt-Åke and many others, to push this each time in emerging countries, which meant also that we could relax and sit here and enjoy these Globelics conferences all these years, and today for the 11th time. And now, of course, I'm here at the start of Globelics, giving the Freeman lecture on September the 11th, the birthday of Chris Freeman. So it is a pretty extraordinary moment to be here for me. And I think it's these two lucky encounters. This is not the envelope Bengt-Åke gave. This is something else he gave to Chris Freeman back in 2001. My talk here will focus on, as the title suggests, on three areas where I've got to know Chris and I've worked most closely with him over the periods 1978 till 2001. I will not discuss the more recent periods because basically from 2001 to some extent, his 80th birthday was to some extent the extent where we pushed Chris on his own in the sense that he could further develop his ideas, but primarily as a community. My work certainly has been very much influenced by Chris over that period. And I'll cover three areas. First, I'd say a little bit about the work very much on industrial innovation, and I'll try to argue why the focus has always been on this industrial side, and why this is typical for Chris Freeman and how it emerged and evolved. Thank you. And why it evolved over a period and it moved away to some extent from the industrial side, but still it is the industrial side which has been dominant in his vision on innovation. So when we talked this morning already about the broad scope of innovation, the reference made to Fabio Elbert by José Casognato, you could already see that there's different directions. There was, certainly in the work of Chris Freeman, there was a particular line by which one would approach innovation. Second, I'll talk a little bit more about, of course, his more radical and visionary work on technological unemployment, which is work which was, of course, the work he started in the late 80s and continued, and I will cover that period also because we were closely involved under the Tempo project within SPRU in that work, and afterwards it continued within Europe and within the OECD. And then finally I focus a little bit on the international shifting world line. I'll see how far I come given this. I don't wear watches since I'm Rector Magnificus anymore because you don't need a watch in that position. You wake up in the morning, you go to your office, you have meetings, and you just go to meetings and then they tell you there is another person waiting, and that's the nice thing. So you don't need a watch anymore, so you have to tell me now and then how good I'm doing or how bad I'm doing. I'll try each time to highlight the relevance of that work of Chris Freeman for the situation today. And then in conclusion, I would like to focus on some aspects of Chris Freeman's work which I think have been insufficiently acknowledged, but which are certainly interesting lessons also for this community. And I'll focus, and maybe this might surprise some of you, I'll focus on two features in particular: the commitment to optimism as antidote against academic and policy cynicism, as it is popular, I would also say, particularly today. And secondly, the need to enlarge and broaden our analysis going beyond economics, and particularly going beyond microeconometrics. Let me start with a quote. And when preparing this lecture over the summer holidays, I also had the opportunity, already since last year, to have to clean up my office, and I found a lot of documents going back to Chris, and old documents also about Chris. And this is a quote which I got from Jean-Jacques Salomon, which was written, I don't know exactly when, it must be in the period 78, 82, 83, at the moment when the OECD was confronted very much with economic crisis, and that both Chris Freeman, Dick Nelson, Pete Babbitt, and others were part of this particular committee at the OECD to advise on science and technology. And I think it's a quote which is, I think, an interesting quote, also from the perspective of being written now nearly, 40 years ago. And if you look at it, it is quite astonishing what is written in there. It is altogether astonishing that the majority of economists today should have forgotten so completely the legacy of their founding fathers, who, from Adam Smith to Schumpeter via Marx, took due notice of the influence of technical change in its causes and effects on economic life. It has taken the current crisis, we're talking about the crisis after 75-82, the ending of economic growth, the reappearance and the persistence of unemployment, the uncertainty surrounding economic theory as well as practice, to to bring about the rediscovery of the obvious fact on which Chris Freeman has constantly drawn from his pioneering thinking and research. Since the Industrial Revolution, the dynamics of change, that is the combination of industrial capitalism and technical innovation, have condemned social structures, societies, civilizations as a whole to discontinuity, disequilibrium, adjustment. And I think this shift, which of course is a shift which was very visible within the OECD framework, the rich country framework of the mid-70s, which was following up on the McCracken report, is something which Jean-Jacques highlighted to it, but I think it's a shift which is still with us today. And I think it is a quote which you can repeat today in the most striking way, but covering, of course, now no longer the OECD countries, but the global world. Let me start with three focal areas I wanted to talk about. First, the focus on industrial innovation as we know it. And this is, of course, most clearly expressed in the textbooks of Chris on the economics of industrial innovation. But I think it's something which has been continuous within the framework of the analysis of innovation studies in this early phase to focus indeed on the industrial R&D dimension of innovation. And the reason is, of course, for this is that this goes back to Chris' strong preference and strong interest in history. And for Freeman, of course, the industrial R&D was to some extent a relatively recent phenomenon. Technology always existed. It existed long before the industrial R&D, but it was associated with craftsmanship. It was associated with typically the activities as they were carried out by mechanics, engineering. You see this if you look in more detail at, for instance, patent or patent statistics, you observe very much that in this phase, long before the period of the establishment of industrial R&D labs, you observe many patents in the statistics, and they were taken out by even technical people in these factories, engineers, people who typically would carry out improvements on existing machinery, existing processes within the factory. And it is basically the industrial R&D phenomenon is really one which is a novelty emerging, as David Maury and many others have written, with the chemical revolution in the late 19th century, and it's really the establishment of industrial R&D activities, trying to get the interaction between science and technology. This is Landis' famous marriage between science and technology, which you find expressed in it. And so while Chris, of course, through his work for the OECD to try to get a measurement idea on these activities, focused very much on this shift, this professionalization, so to say, of industrial research and development within the industrial R&D lab. That is the basis of the Frascati manual. It is the basis of the statistics as they were developed in the late 60s and 70s. And of course, and that's what I put here also clearly, this was the ongoing debate within SPRU, was of course that large parts of technological change as it occurred within companies, within the industrial sector, were not picked up by this professionalization of industrial R&D. Keith Pavitt often mentioned that 80%, 50–80% of those activities were not grasped, picked up by the activities of industrial R&D. And so this is always has been a continuous debate, and you see it coming back very much in the recent ways in which we look at R&D statistics, where we look at services, where we look at innovation, etc. Is the same debate which already existed once we focused on industrial R&D. But what was, of course, essential, and why, of course, Chris focused so much in his economics of industrial innovation on that part, has everything to do with, of course, the professionalization of those activities. The fact that indeed in this industrial R&D labs, one would test, one would provide evidence of particular features of technologies. One would provide the insights in terms of how one could scale up activities, production activities, etc. How, as Nate Rosenberg and many others have described, this would lead to an increasing set of activities in terms of technology, industrial, mechanical, electronic engineer as they emerged as new métiers, as new typically skills as they were required, primarily from the perspective of the interaction between the industrial R&D lab and the production activities. And of course, the chemical industry, not surprisingly, was the first one to obtain this, because this was where the tensions were the highest between the small-scale activity, the laboratory experiment, and the industrial production, with all the dangers, all the promise of producing at a scale of 1,000 or 2,000 times what was carried out within an industrial product. This is, of course, the basis of how this led to what we call today the R&D intensive sector. The sectors where you have large activities professionalized within industrial R&D laboratories and activities. And this is, of course, which became to some extent the core feature of industrial technology policy. We had industrial policies, of course, within the 60s and the 70s, but the change which occurred thanks to this work of Freeman on industrial innovation, the measurement of such professional industrial R&D, is that suddenly the discussion on policy, on industrial policy, shifted to the dynamics of industry. Before, this was very much a policy which was framed within the need for adjustment, in the framework of industrial adjustment, of the way one would shift out of industries with low value added, or one would, as in the European case, one would focus on scale advantages, think of iron and steel, strategic industries, but also industries where there were tremendous overlapping activities between different European countries. How to achieve those scale advantages was the dominant feature of industrial policy. What Chris added to it, so to say, is the shift, which was followed up later on in all these moves from the sunrise to the sunrise, sunbelt to sunrise industries, was the shift from industrial policy to industrial technology policy. And I think this is really important because it highlights the feature that the dynamics, it's basically back the discussion we had this morning about the middle income gap and the middle income trap. How can you shift your technologies in these industrial activities that you shift, that you get a higher growth potential by shifting your industrial structure, so to say, to high-tech R&D intensive industry. It's interesting, of course, from a European perspective, and this is, of course, my own most, say, the perspective I know best, to see how Europe, of course, tried to organize this and basically failed. When you look at the whole Barcelona target, which was the most expressive way in pushing this argument, is that one would shift to those industrial technologies by this 3% R&D target, that R&D target, of course, was never achieved, and that it's very unlikely that, contrary to many emerging countries where similar targets are being set up, Europe will ever achieve that target. So I think that what you find is the history of this industrial innovation, the way it linked to industrial policy and particularly industrial technology policy, had a very strong policy normative content to it, which was highly British and, of course, European focused in this way. I think by saying so, of course, there is no doubt that Chris was very much aware of the fact that this industrial R&D lab was not an isolated activity. I've titled this here, You Never Innovate Alone, basically, but then a Sheffield version of the Anfield song. You know that Chris was a very strong supporter of Sheffield Wednesday as football club. So in this sense, Chris always had recognized these interactions. It is just that he never had pushed them as making a radical shift in the way Mike Gibbons, many others did afterwards with the mode 2 of industrial innovation which came out. So you see this back in the critique of the linear model, as illustrated, for instance, in other work very much on the Mensch swarming hypothesis, the way technologies would be just happened to be operating at the same time in a period of time, was for Chris a critique, because there was no interaction. These were really isolated innovations or inventions more, and the fact that they were clustering, there was absolutely no relationship between them. So Chris was always very convinced and interested in the networking, in the interaction. That's also what led to the whole taxonomy discussions with Pete Babbitt on the origins and the nature of technological change between sectors. Also, what I would say, you never innovate alone, because Chris was also very much aware, and certainly in the second point here, that innovation occurred not just within the R&D system, but outside of the R&D system. His whole point had been precisely to highlight the industrial R&D as a professionalization of activities which occurred beyond that. And of course the same held for organizational innovation and particularly for social innovation. It's also true, and I'll come back to this in the shifting world part of my talk, that the relevance of innovation policy at all levels of development was always there too. Chris focused very much on, first, when still at the National Institute, on the British situation of particular sectors, moved with Spru, of course, to a much more global dimension, but still very much UK focused, but then very quickly moved in the global directions, as I will show and illustrate later on in my talk also. And of course, the recognition for the mutual learning, for the interaction you find is also very much recognized, for instance, in the SAFO project, Success and Failure of Innovation, where you see these continuous interactions between users, between communities of practice, between the sectoral differences, the agriculture sector, for instance, with its extension schemes, between the interaction with the marketing, the local entrepreneurship, etc. is all very clearly mentioned again in the SAFO project. But it's clear that the shifts in the characteristics of innovation, as we discussed them, for instance, here at Globelics, or we have discussed them before, were not there in that work. Chris did not go in the direction as it would be, for instance, with the Mode 2, as suggested, the radical different distributed nature of knowledge between universities and between the service sectors, etc. Were not things where Chris really has focused on. And the reason is, as I tried to argue before, or later on, is of course that he had moved very much into the focus on particular the microelectronics and the ICT sector itself as the major sector, bringing about a pervasive effect on the economy. So his Mode 2 analysis was never there, as it was, for instance, with respect to Mike Gibbons, Helga Novotny, and many other people in Manchester and others who focused on that analysis. I think Dick Nelson actually illustrated probably the best, where Dick went in a direction which much more explicitly argued about the differences in these industrial innovation and the alternative modes of innovation. You see this very much in the way Dick described this in I think, Structural Change in Economic Dynamics in 2000, probably late 90s, 2000, where you find a description about how the process within the industrial research laboratory is very much focused on how can I keep in place the particular breakthrough, the particular innovation, and in the scaling up, I have to move this, as Dick puts it, the ability to hold in place, to replicate, to imitate what I got in the industrial lab in terms of large-scale production. Whereas in the new process, this is still very much the case in all these industrial sectors, from automobiles to consumer electronics, chemicals, where the tightness of the knowledge behind it is absolutely essential. But Dick pushed very much his focus on all these other sectors. The health sector, the education sector, all the other sectors where these processes are very different, where laboratory experiments cannot be replicated, where things are very much time dependent in terms of the interaction of that particular moment, where the particular context in terms of the users, the listeners, the patients, etc., is much more essential in terms of setting up particular protocols or particular routines. And I think this is very much where you see a difference in terms of where Chris really moved in different directions and didn't really focus so much on the innovation process going beyond the industrial sector. Let me come to my second area. In terms of time, I'll have to mind here and there speed. And this is, of course, the area of technological unemployment. And it's interesting to observe how Chris got into that area, because Chris basically was not interested in macroeconomics. Chris was very much interested in the details of the innovation process, in the microeconomic features. You see this recognized both in his studies on the chemical industry, the microelectronics industries, the work also in international trade and technology policy. The macroeconomic framework, and in particular the employment aspect, is something which he had not looked at and was not really at the core center of his interest. And of course, it's amazing to see how that interest really emerged somewhere in the mid-70s, when he started to read and be confronted with a number of arguments about, in particular, about, well, the emerging crisis, the response to the McCracken report, the OECD report, which is basically arguing that this was a Keynesian problem, and that basically there needed to be reinvestment on the Keynesian nature, and which sort of led to the very high inflation, to all the structural problems which Europe in particular, but the whole Western world witnessed at that moment. And so the discovery and the search for alternative explanation, and particularly the focus on Schumpeter, is something really which occurred in Chris's thinking in this period of the mid-70s. And of course it has certainly led me with Chris into different directions, and in views, etc. The report we wrote for the European Commission back in 1994, where we put forward, if you imagine, for the first time the idea of a bid tax, where we put forward all kind of crazy ideas about the digital. The word digital wasn't used at that time yet. It's pretty amazing to see how little progress has been made in many of these areas, and how many of these aspects were predicted or were expected to occur much more rapidly than what we did at that time. And this bid tax idea was, of course, an idea, repeating it from Faraday, the famous quote from Faraday, when he invented electricity. He said, "I don't know what this will be ever used for, I just know one thing, one day it will be taxed." Well, you could say, with respect to internet and digital communication, we know one thing, that we know what it is being used for, but it hasn't been taxed and it is still for free. And this is one of the big issues. I'm not going to elaborate on this issue, this is more for something else, but if you calculate simply a company like, take the largest company in the world, Google, or the second one, and you calculate how they are valued in terms of GDP or other measures, they are valued by the advertising revenues they generate. And any economist, any consultancy firm can calculate that that value is a fraction of the real value of a good. So you have a whole part of our economy which is basically not valued, through this link to being basically for free. So this raises interesting issues about what in such economies is indeed the value of what is being generated, what are the tax revenues the state can earn in such a sort of economy. But I leave this to, this was not part of my talk, this is interesting for another discussion. But back in 1985, of course, when we celebrated in 1986, also in Lewis, if you remember Bengt-Åke, the 65th anniversary of Chris Freeman, and we presented him with this Festschrift, I had been asked to write a piece which was on technological innovation, employment, and long waves. And this piece was a long piece, and of course, when it was published, it had to be cut, and it's been cut to a third of what is written in there. But it's a piece, and this is always the problem with Festschrift pieces, these are the pieces which will never be cited by, in this case, Chris Freeman. So it's a piece with zero citations, but I still consider it as one of my better pieces. But let me, this is the advantage of moving offices, is that you find long forgotten archive papers, which are still in the method of having been typed by yourself, etc. And so let me quote from this, because when we worked on the Tempo project, the whole analysis of employment in technology was something which was heavily criticized by many of our innovation scholars, from Keith Babbitt to Dick Nelson to many others, who said this was really ridiculous to work on technological unemployment and on any relationship. I still remember when leaving a SPRU seminar where Chris had presented his thoughts on technology and unemployment, that we were called afterwards, when we left out the room, by Ian Miles and others Luddites. They were shouting at us, etc., leaving the seminar. So these were ideas which were not, at that stage, certainly not accepted, particularly within the macroeconomic community. So let me just say that what I wrote in that paper. Some doubt as to the significance, if not relevance, of Freeman's contribution to this macroeconomic debate. It relates the technology employment debate to an even more controversial topic, such as long waves, the subject of as many imaginary as serious contribution, is prone to raise even more questions about the significance of Freeman's work. Could it not be the case that Freeman, as so many other technology experts before him, has ignored many of the macroeconomic price adjustments leading to employment compensation, overestimating therefore the employment displacement nature of technological change? At the same time, is there also not a presumption that precisely because of its detailed technological knowledge, he will, as so many other innovation specialists, be inclined to overestimate both the revolutionary employment impact and the speed of the diffusion throughout the economy of these rather few technically revolutionary inventions or innovations. I then go on and I, of course, argue that this is not the case, and that on the contrary, Freeman just by his detailed knowledge could shed some new lights on this. And so, basically what this led to is what what's interesting in this view is that Freeman, from a very pessimistic view, which was really based on the critique on the traditional compensation mechanism as they were assumed to operate, and I'm talking really here about the late 70s, shifted very much thanks to Schumpeter and to the interest in Schumpeter to a much more optimistic view, which then became totally optimistic with what I've called in this paper the rejuvenated Freeman, which of course had a lot to do with the ideas, but also with the meeting of Carlota Perez and the integration of some of his ideas about new, as he called it at that time, new technology systems, and the ideas of Carlota on techno-economic or socio-economic paradigm. I just read you one other paragraph of this paper where this overview is given, because this was given really in the early days, in 85, when Chris and Carlota had basically started to work together on some of those ideas. The emergence of Freeman's concept of new technological systems might well be considered as similar to the concept of change in technological paradigm used already extensively in his Schumpeterian writings and those of many of his colleagues, such as Giovanni Dossi and others. However, until 1983, the paradigm concept was only introduced in Freeman's long-wave thinking in the more narrow technological meaning of the term as developed by Giovanni Dossi. Furthermore, whereas the change in paradigm role of a new technology system was indeed already acknowledged in the Schumpeterian Freeman, the emphasis was on the application and exploitation of the various phases of the long wave of the broad natural trajectories of technology, such as mechanization, electrification, or automation. To put it in Giovanni Dossi's terminology, the focus appeared more on the thermostat function of technical change rather than on its engine function. This was in many ways understandable. Much in line with his earlier thoughts, Freeman's concerns, even though they had shifted, were still very much geared towards an explanation of why, over the various phases of the long wave, technical change would change in its employment growth effects, and with the onslaught of the recession might become predominantly labor-saving. And so this is where you see this shift, which is in line with what I mentioned before, an industrial innovation of the focus very much on the technology, where the start, of course, of his knowledge and analysis comes, and where the interaction with employment is given by this employment displacement features into a direction of a much more understanding of the internal dynamics, the discontinuities, the Schumpeterian creative destruction, if you want to call it this way, into a direction of these kind of techno-economic paradigms, which Carlota, of course, has been very much working from then on with Chris. So if we look at this from this perspective, we could say that what Chris has brought into this debate is clearly a number of basic elements, which I think it's important for us to understand in the current debate. That is that technological progress generates, first and foremost, new wealth. This increased wealth leads to higher effective demand, which causes itself increased investment and labor hiring in order to satisfy this increased demand through the production, distribution, and sale of new products or services. So in the short term, technical progress might hence destroy jobs, but the increase in productivity, disposable income will lead to increase in effective demand, and so eventually also to the creation of new jobs. That general compensation framework is still there too, but it is still there within a framework, of course, that these jobs are a shorthand name for income. And whether most people effectively partake in enjoying part of this higher total income, this new wealth, will be very much depending on the labor market, the income policies, the distributional policies, accompanying, of course, the new technologies, not on the technologies per se. Did this subsequent evidence, do we find after all this was written in the mid-80s. Do we find evidence which is confirming this view? Well, I would say in general, yes, you find a very strong support for the view that these new technologies, in particular digital information and communication technologies, have been technologies which have, thank you, have very much strongly influenced productivity growth. Productivity growth not just in the measured part of our economies, but also in the other parts. It's also, you can observe also in this sense, all the work done at the OECD with Bengt-Åke, with the Americans, Alexander and many others, there have shown that basically those countries which were slow in the uptake of these new technologies witnessed the lowest productivity growth and often were also the countries with the highest rises in unemployment. I would even go a step further, and of some work done by Boris Lehir, also today at UNU Merit, that you can argue actually that within the European framework, and this is open for debate, but it was the core of his PhD thesis, that if you look at information communication technologies and more generally knowledge investment, you will see that you can find a real explanation for the euro crisis. It's one of the few analyses which have really looked at it, and that you find that in the period of the introduction of the euro and the establishment of the euro within the European Union zone, you see huge differentiated rates of adoption of information communication technologies, and hence of productivity growth, and hence of unemployment. So this is one of the few examples of finding a real relationship with technology, productivity growth, and actually a real factor behind the euro crisis. You see this, for instance, it is striking to see that in this recent period, the uptake and the contribution of that part which Boris calculated as part of the knowledge economy, which is this relatively complex way in calculating the contribution of ICT to economic growth, has really declined significantly in some of those southern European countries, precisely in the period of the introduction of the euro. I think that this shift in Freeman's thinking, of course, underlies one of the points which I think Carlotta made already last year in her Freeman lecture, and that is this fundamentally optimistic view of Chris in society's capacity for technological, economic, social, and institutional adaptation. And I think this is really the core message which he always had. As I put it here, again, this is from the overview paper in the first script of Freeman. So for Freeman, just like Smith and Marx, technology is in the final instance a liberating force. One which has the potential for greater variety and satisfaction from work, one which could lead to higher degrees of autonomy, responsibility, and skill within the workforce. But that's what Chris always said. Whether this will occur or not is, of course, depending on the policy side, and technology in this sense is neither good or bad. It is just a feature. It is in this sense a liberating force. I'll come back to this. Let me put one nuance to this in terms of what, since Chris's passing away, I have tried to argue in more recent work. And this goes really, and I had the pleasure to do this at Bengt-Åke's much later festschrift celebrations, etc. That is that, of course, this process of Schumpeterian creative destruction, as we know it, as a wealth-enhancing process, destroying a few incumbents at the benefits of many, and hence raising welfare and the welfare of society as a whole, and then, of course, raising the issue of how it would be distributed across skills, across incomes, etc., might well, and I still would argue that, strongly argue that that is the case, that it might well be the mirror image of this process, which I would call destructive creation. There is no reason why there could not be innovation processes which have exactly the opposite feature. That is that they benefit a few at the expense of many and of society, and ultimately lead you to lower levels of development. And in this talk, in the Maria Roda lecture, I gave 3 examples of such destructive creation. And this is also something I did. Some of you might have been there in Oxford last week, where we had a conference on technology management. First, it's very difficult to deny, and when you look at many of the papers discussed here, there are many papers dealing with the ecological dimension, with the transition needs. But it's difficult to deny that you could well be confronted with the process at the product innovation level, which is a process of destructive creation. And you know, we seem to forget that in this whole framework of Schumpeterian analysis of growth, there was of course an element which is the monopoly rents which accrue to the firms, which are the trigger, the dynamics of innovation. But those monopoly rents of firms, as shown in the model of Calvano, can very well be triggered by the desire to wreck the existing stock of consumer goods. And so what you get then is a model which is basically a model whereby it is profitable for firms not to innovate in new areas of product satisfaction, but just to innovate in the marginal improvements in products, which basically are only given by trying to destroy the existing stock of consumer goods. And actually, Emilio Calvano's model shows that this is perfectly profitable, and that firms will be triggered to follow this line. Remember all the cases of planned obsolescence of our famous company Apple, which in 2003 was brought before court because it had, on purpose, reduced the lifespan of the batteries within their iPad at that time, which was earmarked towards the way in which we could force the consumers to buy the next generation. So within the framework of our, and this is still an area where we need much more work, which is really done on the consumer good level with respect to innovation. To what extent are processes there of destructive creation common, are part of the unsustainable nature, the conspicuous innovation nature, conspicuous consumption nature of our societies, leading us into this kind of ecologically unsustainable development. I still think this is, and I'm of course delighted to see so many papers addressing the opposite pattern, of course, of eco-innovations, of all kinds of forms by which we achieve a transition away from this kind of unsustainable consumption level. Second, of course, financial innovations. I think it's difficult as an innovation community to ignore the impact of financial innovations on the spreading of risks across the system. And again, each of these financial innovations were very much earmarked to breakthroughs, to new products, new financial products, which in themselves were really innovative. There were new ways of risk coverage by which the systemic risks increased quite dramatically. So again, here, a very strong example of the nature of the way in which this process of destructive creation operates. Third, of course, and not surprising, given myself coming from Maastricht, having witnessed the Maastricht Treaty, the signing of the Maastricht Treaty even, having debated about the nonsense of building a monetary union in a phase of integration where monetary union is the end, so to say, is the final part of the integration process, having seen how this was decided back in the early 90s, you could really say that as an institutional innovation, the euro is the other example of destructive creation.
You get 15 minutes extra.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So in each of these cases, and going a little bit outside of the framework of the traditional Schumpeterian framework of creative destruction, I would argue that our societies are certainly confronted with the opposite pattern, and that we really have to deal with these issues whereby society's capacity to develop innovations that could well lead you to the exact opposite, short-term employment creation. Think of the financial sector. Enormous new employment creation thanks to the financial innovations, but in the long term, massive negative employment impact of the diffusion of these risks across the board. So as a preliminary conclusion on this part of technological employment, Chris Freeman has made very fundamental insights showing the complexity and how these complexities were way beyond what traditional economics had to say about in terms of the time lags, in terms of the various other impacts, etc. And that certainly from this perspective, the evidence seemed to suggest, also in line, of course, with traditional compensation theory,